the 7 men were convicted in June of committing sexual offences against 2 girls between 2001 and 2006. The judge said that both girls were highly vulnerable and from deeply troubled backgrounds, and both were seriously let down by those whose job it was to protect them. Let's speak now to Maggie Oliver, former detective constable with Greater Manchester Police turned whistleblower to help expose the grooming gang scandal, also founder of the Maggie Oliver Foundation. Good evening. Thank you very much for being with us. And first of all, I just wonder what you make of the sentences today.
I think, Mark, that finally I see sentences that reflect the magnitude of this kind of offending. You know, these are sentences that I wanted to see before I resigned from GMP. You know, a man who got a 13-year-old child pregnant out of prison in less than 4 years. Finally, I think that these sentences send out a very clear message that this kind of offending won't be ignored anymore. I hope it will be a deterrent. What I would like to see is consistency in other cases, because we still have a really patchy, we have very patchy sentencing depending on who the judge is, who is responsible for sentencing. I mean, the judge said that these 2 young women were seriously let down by the authorities, and that's what I've seen for 20 years. You know, I take my hat off. These 2 women have got my never-ending respect and admiration for having the perseverance and the strength to see this through. Their whole lives have been impacted not only by their abuse, but by the failures of the authorities to protect them and to deal with their perpetrators. Some of those men, John, that I see on your lineup before, are men that I knew from the Rochdale case that I worked on, which was in 2010, 11, 12. So, you know, these children were abused in the early 2000s and 2005 and 6. We're 20 years on from that. How many other children have those men raped, abused, and how many other lives have been destroyed? But, you know, I do think that the public are now fully aware of this kind of crime. I think people power and what's gone on this year in the media is a big part of why we have seen these sentences. And I don't think this is ever going to go away. You know, and this is the kind of sentencing that we need. What we do need, though, is much quicker investigations so that these young women and these children can get on with their lives without this massive black cloud hanging over them every day. You know, you mentioned that I started the Maggie Oliver Foundation. So this is one case. It feels like Groundhog Day, because this pattern is what we see again and again and again. And we really, really, as a country, need to address it properly and not be turning away from it. The public now are facing up to it and demanding change. The authorities are still wriggling around and trying to pretend that this doesn't happen when it happens regularly throughout the country.
Right. So, I mean, and the victim impact statements, as you were just referring to, what they've been through. My childhood was taken away from me. I was raped, made to feel worthless. And then, but they did say, both young women made clear their own pride in what they've achieved by going through the process. Yeah. I have never moved on from the abuse, but this process was the most positive thing I have ever done. I have told my truth. How important do you think today is for them?
It is critically important, and it will be life-changing for them. You know, in my charity, we offer an advocacy service. And even if a victim doesn't always get justice through the criminal justice system, to be believed, to be heard, to be cared for and treated with empathy will help them to recover. And I don't know the officers that were dealing with these 2 young women, but it's very clear to me from what those young women have written that those officers supporting them have done a very good job. And even if they hadn't had justice in the courts, knowing that they've been heard and believed and that somebody has fought their corner, like we do in the foundation, will help them to move forward. Obviously, these young women have got justice. They will feel proud of themselves, and rightly so. But the impact of what they've endured will never leave them. It will stay with them for the rest of their lives. So I hope that this is the start of a new era where we see every child rapist being sentenced to this length of sentence. I would lock them away and throw away the key, but I want to see the authorities step up. You know, I'm not going to deflect from this case, but the national inquiry that we're waiting for, they're trying with every breath in their body to water it down. So we still have a lot of resistance to facing up to what has been going on for decades.
Right, I mean, what these two have been through, one of these young women has been talking about having to go through 40 detailed video interviews. So one hopes future victims will not have to go through that kind of thing.
That's what you would hope, John. But as I said at the beginning, it is very much hit and miss who you get in these cases. That should never happen. You know, we've got technology now. We should be able to do one thorough, fully detailed interview without keep putting these victims through the same thing again and again. You know, we're supporting victims who have been 6 years stuck in a no man's land waiting for their abusers to be charged, where they've already identified them in ID parades. As a country, we still have a long way to go to put victims at the heart of these cases, because they always suffer the most. The quicker we can do these things, the more effectively first-time interviews they do, then the easier the toll is on their mental health. Everything that can be done to help them should be done.
And just finally, by the way, it's Mark, not John, Maggie.
Sorry.
You started off well with a Mark. But look, just a serious point on this awful story to end. You talked about the inquiry, the national inquiry. What would you like to see done before the inquiry? Because you know what these inquiries are like. They can take for a very, very long time indeed. What is urgently needed to be done?
What is urgently needed is transparency and honesty, and that is not what's happening. You know, I've got streams of messages between Jess Phillips and individual victims. You know, they're wanting to water it down, not to look at grooming gangs anymore, to look at all group-based abuse, to bring in CSA as well as CSE. They are trying to water down the content of this inquiry. And actually, let's have it right. At the moment, it is not a national inquiry. Oldham have just been told today that they're looking at another sort of different version of the Truth Project. We are not having any real conversations about what is needed. And so I still see the authorities pushing the ball down the road. We still haven't had the 20 recommendations of the national inquiry, ICSA, from 2022 implemented. You know, my foundation, we are taking the government to a judicial review to try to force them to implement those 20 recommendations. So an inquiry, the word inquiry means nothing. What are the terms of reference? Who is the chair? What powers do they have? Will they implement recommendations? What I don't want to see, Mark, is to see victims and survivors put their trust in an inquiry, which is a paper exercise. And that's what I saw on ICSA. So, you know, I'm very sceptical about where this inquiry will go. And I think there's a lot of people will be watching it very closely. And I'm sorry for getting your name wrong, Mark.
Well, that's a very minor thing. Maggie, appreciate you coming on to talk about this. And we'll talk about it at greater length again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.